You know, usually when we look at a historical document, there's this expectation of, well, stillness.
Right.
Like looking at a fossil in a museum display, you see the outline of the bones, the little informational placard gives you the date, and it's silent, it's clean, it's frozen under glass.
Perfectly preserved, heavily categorized, and, totally inert.
Exactly. But step into the world of 14th century English poetry, and someone essentially takes a hammer and just shatters that
Yeah,
glass.
completely shatters it.
Suddenly, you aren't looking at an artifact anymore. You are standing in the middle of a medieval tavern or a bustling, mud-soaked street in London. It's loud, it smells like raw sewage and roasted meat, it's messy, and it is aggressively, violently alive.
It really is.
Welcome to our deep dive. We are taking the source material on the age of Chaucer, and we are going to decode the actual DNA of the modern English language. We're looking at the chaotic birth of the stories we still tell today.
And it is the absolute definition of a historical and cultural pressure cooker. I mean, to really grasp Geoffrey Chaucer and the literary explosion of this era, you cannot separate the art from the chaos that birthed it.
Right, the plague, the wars.
Exactly. But even before we look at those societal upheavals, the plagues, the corruption, we actually have to start with a fundamental question. How do we actually read a medieval poem?
Which sounds like a trick question, honestly. You just read it, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
But a poem is not an objective document. If you're looking at a mathematical theorem by Euclid, the subjectivity, the personal desires of Euclid himself, they don't matter at all. The math is just the math.
Yeah, a triangle is a triangle.
Right. Literature, on the other hand, is built on what literary theorists call the specular moment.
The specular moment.
Yes. It records not just the concrete, verifiable events of a person's life, but their unfulfilled wishes, their dreams, the phantom lives they didn't get to live.
So it's a mirror, but it's reflecting what almost happened or what the author desperately wished had happened.
Exactly. The philosopher Jacques Derrida talks about this in terms of the human obsession with keeping a trace of the voices that traverse through us. He uses this brilliant concept called iterability.
Wait, I'm stuck on that word. Iterability. Isn't that just a fancy way of saying repeating? Like iterating a process?
It's related, but the nuance is really crucial here. It comes from the Sanskrit root iter, which actually means different or other. So iterability means that history and language repeat, yes, but they repeat with a difference.
Repeat with a difference.
Right. Every time a word is used, every time a historical pattern cycles back around, the new context fundamentally changes its meaning.
Oh, wow. Okay, think about how this scales down to normal life. If I read a highly emotional text message from a friend the day I receive it, it means one thing.
Yes.
But if I pull up that exact same text message 5 years later, after we've had a huge falling out, the words are identical. They repeated. But the context has totally warped the meaning.
It repeated with a difference. That is a perfect modern analogy. And this brings us to a massive foundational shift in how we study literature. Classic literary criticism used to be entirely focused on the author.
Like Biography 101.
Yeah, it was what we call the poetics of writing. Critics, like the ones Roland Barthes has pushed back against, were constantly searching for the message of the author god. They believed that if you just understood everything about Chaucer's biography, you would perfectly understand his poetry.
Because he was the all-knowing creator of the text.
Right. But modern criticism pivots to the poetics of reading. Barthes has argued that a text isn't a single line of words with one true theological meaning hidden by the author. A text is a multidimensional space. It is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture.
Now, the sources mention two highly intimidating terms for this: archaeological criticism versus eschatological criticism. And I have to be honest, eschatological usually refers to the apocalypse, the end of the world.
It does, yeah.
So how on earth does the apocalypse apply to reading a poem about a knight and a miller?
Well, it's a heavy word, but think of it not as the end of the world, but the end of the meaning-making process.
Oh, okay.
Archaeological criticism is digging backward into the author's past, the open-ended text, the influences, the cultural soil they grew in. But eschatological criticism focuses on the ultimate destination of the text.
Which is the reader.
Exactly. The text remains an open, unresolved space until you, the reader, arrive at it. You impose the final meaning. You close the loop. Without the reader, the poem doesn't fully exist.
That is incredibly empowering for the audience. We aren't just passive receptacles, you know. We are active participants in finishing the art.
We really are.
But before we can finalize the meaning of these 14th century poems, we need to understand the mechanical tools the poets were using to build them in the first place. The physical structure,
A
versification.
grammar of poetry.
I always used to think of poetic meter as the drum track of a song, but that feels a little too mechanical now. It's more like the heartbeat or the natural walking cadence of the language. It is the systematic convention of organizing sound for aesthetic purposes.
Beautifully put.
And our sources identify four principal feet in English poetry.
And a foot is just the smallest structural unit of meter, a specific repeating pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. The most famous, the one that essentially defines English poetry, is the iamb.
The classic dedium.
Exactly. An unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one. Words like appear, behold, attack, supply. It sounds like a human heartbeat, which is why it feels so natural to native English speakers.
Da 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 dum. But then you have the trochee, which completely flips that dynamic. Da. Stressed, then unstressed. Tiger, holy, upper.
Notice the psychological shift there. An iamb builds up to a climax, appear. A trochee lands heavy right away and then falls away tiger. Feels much more aggressive, more forceful.
Absolutely. The third foot is the anapacist. Two unstressed, one stressed. Da 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 diamem.
Understand. Colonnade. It has a sort of skipping, galloping momentum to
And
it.
the fourth is the dactyl. One stressed, followed by two unstressed. Dum dada. Desperate, messenger, property.
Dactyls always feel to me like you've just tripped and you're tumbling down a flight of stairs. Diapeate. It's front-loaded and then just spills forward. So those are the big four we use today. But in the 14th century, English was still a linguistic Wild West, right?
Well, completely.
There were competing metrical systems fighting for dominance.
Yes, before syllable stress meter, like iambic pentameter, fully won out, you had three alternative systems. The oldest native English system is strong stress meter. This comes straight from our Germanic Anglo-Saxon roots. You see this in Beowulf, and even contemporaneously with Chaucer in William Langland's Piers Plowman.
How does that one work? It ignores the total number of syllables entirely. It doesn't care if there are 2 or 7 unstressed syllables between the beats. It only cares that there is a fixed number of heavy, stressed beats per line, usually 4, and it ties them together with heavy alliteration.
Oh, interesting.
It sounds like a warrior pounding a spear on a shield.
But then you have the total opposite coming across the channel from France and Italy. Syllabic meter. Romance languages like French don't have the heavy, aggressive stress accents that Germanic languages do, so they just counted the strict number of syllables per line.
Yeah.
10 syllables, period. Doesn't matter where the emphasis falls.
Right. And finally, you have quantitative meter. This is fascinating, but a total nightmare in English. It's based entirely on the physical time it takes to pronounce a vowel, long vowels versus short vowels.
Like musical notes, a half note versus a quarter note.
Precisely. It was the standard in highly inflected ancient languages like Greek and Latin. But by the 14th century, English had lost almost all of its complex word endings and inflections. Trying to write quantitative meter in Middle English was like trying to play a piano piece on a drum kit. The instrument just wasn't built for it anymore.
No, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
When you lay out all these rules, counting syllables, tracking stresses, worrying about iambs and dactyls, doesn't that just crush the soul of the artist? It sounds like you're putting creativity in a mathematical straitjacket.
It's a very modern romantic assumption that rules stifle creativity.
Huh.
The sources bring in 2 brilliant counterarguments from the poet Sri Aurobindo and T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
Aurobindo argued the exact opposite of the straitjacket theory. He said that meter is the most natural mold for creative emotion,
How so?
because raw, shapeless emotion is just noise. Aurobindo believed that when the substance of what you are trying to say is adequate, when you have true inspiration, the rigid technique of meter doesn't suppress the beauty, it actively magnifies it.
Wow.
It forces the chaotic emotion into a powerful rhythmic channel. It gives water a pipe to flow through, so it becomes a geyser instead of a puddle.
I love that. A geyser instead of a puddle. And T.S. Eliot essentially said that studying meter is like looking at a simplified map of a highly complicated territory. You have to train your ear, you have to know where the established roads are before you can purposefully drive off a cliff to make a point.
Exactly. You have to master the rules to brilliantly break them. And the poet who truly established this syllable stress map for the English language was Geoffrey Chaucer. He took the aggressive beats of his native English and married them to the elegant syllable counting of the French and Italians.
Okay, so we understand the heartbeat of the poetry. Now we need to look at the literal heartbeats of the people in the 14th century.
And there were a lot fewer of them suddenly.
Right, because if we connect this structural chaos to the historical reality, the world that Chaucer was writing in was undergoing apocalyptic levels of upheaval, feudalism. The rigid system of lords, knights, and peasants that had ordered society for centuries was collapsing, and the middle class was being born out of the ashes.
And the primary catalyst for this was quite literally catastrophic: the Black Death. It hit England around 1348 and peaked through 1349. We are talking about a plague that wiped out roughly a third of the entire English population.
It's almost impossible to conceptualize that level of sudden mortality. Imagine one out of every three people, just gone in the span of months.
The human tragedy was unfathomable, but the socioeconomic aftermath was what completely rewired the country. With a third of the population gone, there was suddenly a massive, unprecedented labor shortage.
Right. If you are a medieval lord, your entire wealth is based on the grain grown on your land. But suddenly the peasants who plow the fields are dead. The crops are rotting. The lord is desperate.
And the surviving peasants realized this immediately. For the first time in centuries, the leverage shifted. The old inherited obligations of feudal tenure, where a peasant was basically tied to the land and worked for free in exchange for protection, suddenly looked absurd.
They woke up.
Yes, the peasant could say, if you want this wheat harvested, you're going to pay me cash wages, and you're going to pay me double what you paid my father.
The crown actually panicked, didn't they? They tried to pass laws like the Statute of Laborers to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, which just made the commoners furious.
Exactly. It completely disrupted the social hierarchy. It also gutted the church. Thousands of parish priests died, leaving huge vacancies. To fill them, the church had to quickly ordain younger, lower-ranking men who were much closer to the peasantry. Many of these new clergy actually sympathized with the laborers' demands against the nobility.
So the domestic economy is in ruins, the class system is cracking, and meanwhile, England is locked into this seemingly endless grinding conflict with France, the Hundred Years' War. And our sources draw this incredibly sharp contrast between the idealized poetry of warfare chivalry and the brutal, muddy reality.
We all know the literary myth of chivalry, the pure holy knight on a white horse fighting for honor and God. The reality of the 14th century was that King Edward III was fundamentally changing how wars were fought. He essentially created the modern infantry.
The yeoman archers.
Yes, common men with longbows. At battles like Crécy and later Agincourt, you had aristocratic French knights in wildly expensive heavy plate armor getting absolutely slaughtered from a distance by English peasants shooting armor-piercing arrows. It was a massive democratization of violence.
The ultimate social equalizer on the battlefield. A lord could be killed by a guy who plows dirt for a living.
And what were the English knights doing during all this? They weren't fighting for pure honor. They were turning war into a commercial enterprise. The primary goal for an English knight wasn't to bravely kill his opponent. It was to capture high-value French nobles and hold them for astronomical ransoms.
Wow.
They were also systematically looting French towns. War was a business. The chivalric code was a beautiful, gilded lie, masking immense greed.
Which brings that tension right back home. All this economic pressure, the wage disputes, the cost of this endless war, it boiled over in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. You have mobs marching on London, burning tax records, executing government officials. But it wasn't just economic, it was spiritual too. Enter the Lollards.
The Lollards are a fascinating group. They were followers of John Wycliffe, an Oxford theologian who looked at the immense hoarding wealth of the Catholic Church and said, this has nothing to do with the teachings of Christ. He heavily criticized the corruption of the clergy, but his most dangerous act was translating the Bible from Latin into English.
Why was that so dangerous?
Because Latin was the firewall. As long as the Bible was only in Latin, the church had an absolute monopoly on the truth. The priest told the peasant what God wanted, and the peasant had no way to verify it. By translating the scripture into the vulgar tongue, Wycliffe bypassed the clergy entirely. He gave the common people direct access to the divine. It was a terrifying loss of control for the establishment.
Wave after wave of disruption, the plague, the economy, the war, the church, and the epicenter of all this swirling chaos is London, Chaucer's London. The sources paint a picture of a city that is so vibrantly alive but incredibly raw. We're talking about a walled town of maybe 40,000 people.
Which sounds small today, but was a massive metropolis for the time.
Right. And the architecture dictated the culture. Mostly timber-framed houses, plaster walls, ground floors weren't enclosed. They were open shop fronts facing right onto the muddy, dung-filled streets. There was almost zero privacy. Ordinary homes didn't have glass windows, just wooden shutters. You heard every argument your neighbor had. You smelled their cooking and their waste.
It was a highly communal, deeply oral society. Secrets did not exist in 14th century London. And in that intensely close environment, the cultural ideals the elites tried to push were constantly crashing into reality. Let's look at the concept of courtly love.
Oh, the classic romantic trope. The knight worships an idealized, utterly perfect woman from afar. He puts her on a pedestal, writes her poetry, goes on dangerous quests to prove his pure, unwavering devotion.
That is the literary fantasy. The historical reality for women in the 14th century was profoundly grim. Marriages, especially among the upper classes that sponsored this poetry, had absolutely nothing to do with love. They were negotiated with ruthless haste for purely commercial and political motives. It was all about consolidating land and property.
This led directly to the horrific practice of widespread child marriage.
Yes, children were betrothed as toddlers to secure alliances. Furthermore, while English law did allow women to inherit property, the society was so violently unstable that a woman essentially needed a powerful husband just to physically defend her land from being stolen by neighbors. And despite all the poetry about worshiping the divine feminine, the physical beating of wives, daughters, and sisters was a widespread, legally and culturally accepted practice.
The gap between the man singing a love song under a balcony and the man beating his wife in the parlor is just staggering. It's cognitive dissonance on a societal scale. And before we move on to how one writer tackled all this, we have to look at how they viewed the physical world itself, their science. Because astrology and medicine were not separate fields, they were the exact same discipline.
The medieval worldview was built on an incredibly intricate, holistic web of correspondences. They believed the 12 signs of the zodiac had direct physical jurisdiction over different parts of the human body. Aries ruled the head, Pisces ruled the feet, and so on.
So your fate, your personality, and your physical health were literally written in the stars at the exact moment of your birth.
Absolutely. This tied directly into the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed health was just the perfect balance of these four fluids, and illness was an imbalance.
Which means a medieval doctor wouldn't just check your pulse. He literally could not prescribe a treatment like bleeding you or giving you herbs without first casting a detailed astrological horoscope to see where the planets were aligned.
Exactly.
It was completely unscientific by modern standards, but you have to admire how beautifully logical it was.
Chaucer was born into.
So the question is, how does one single man manage to capture all this societal chaos? How does he synthesize the failing chivalry, the corrupt church, the rising middle class, and the complex astrology into art? Well, by having a front row seat to literally every single level of society.
Yeah.
Chaucer wasn't a monk locked in a silent abbey. His biography reads like an adventure novel.
He was born around 1343 or 1344 into a family of prosperous London wine merchants. This is key. He wasn't nobility, but his family had new money.
Right, so they place him as a page in a noble household. He learns the aristocratic manners. Then, as a teenager, he goes to fight in the army in France during the 100 Years' War. He actually gets captured by the French during a siege, and King Edward III himself contributes to paying his ransom.
Quite the flex. Following his military service, he enters civil service. And this is where his real education begins. He works as the controller of customs in the Port of London.
Which means he is literally standing on the docks day in and day out, checking wool, hides, and leather exports. He's dealing with rich Italian merchants, corrupt tax collectors, swearing sailors, and exhausted dock workers.
And because he was trusted and highly competent, he was also sent as a diplomat on secret missions across Europe to negotiate trade deals and royal marriages. He was the ultimate, highly observant civil servant.
Think about the psychological advantage that gave him. A guy checking wool on the docks learns exactly how human beings lie, how they barter, how they flatter. He heard every dialect of English, French, and Italian. He had unparalleled access to the raw material of human nature.
And his literary evolution maps perfectly onto those life experiences. The sources divide his career into three distinct periods, starting with his French period, from roughly 1370 to 1380.
French culture was the absolute peak of fashion at the English court. To be taken seriously as a poet, you had to emulate the French.
And the most important work he absorbed was the Roman de la Rose, a massive, insanely popular French allegorical poem. But what's crucial for understanding Chaucer's genius is that this poem was actually written by two different men, decades apart, with two completely opposed worldviews.
Right. The first part was by Guillaume de Loris. He wrote this beautiful, idealized, courtly romance. It's a dream vision full of allegorical characters like fair welcome and danger. It's pure chivalric fantasy.
But he died before finishing it. Decades later, a writer named Jean de Meun came along and finished it. And Jean de Meun was a hardened rationalist and a biting, cynical satirist. He took this beautiful dream world and used it to mercilessly mock the hypocrisy of the clergy, the foolishness of knights, and the ridiculous, impossible standards of courtly love.
So Chaucer translates this, and in doing so, he basically uploads both operating systems into his brain. He learns how to write soaring, beautiful romance, and he learns how to undercut it with gritty, cynical realism. We see him apply this early on in the Book of the Duchess, which is a beautiful, melancholic elegy he wrote for Blanche, the late wife of his powerful political patron, John of Gaunt.
But then his diplomatic career changes everything. He enters his Italian period from 1380 to 1386. He is sent to Florence and Genoa. Remember, this is Italy right on the threshold of the Renaissance. He discovers the works of Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio.
This completely blows his mind and elevates his art. He writes The Parliament of Fowls, which on the surface is a funny poem about birds gathering on St. Valentine's Day to choose their mates. But underneath, it's a razor-sharp social satire.
Oh, totally.
The aristocratic eagles debate endlessly about high concepts of love, while the lower-class waterfowl basically scream, just pick someone so we can go home. It's a brilliant commentary on class divisions.
But his absolute masterpiece of this middle period is Troilus and Cresside.
Okay, we have to stop and marvel at this one. He takes a poem by Boccaccio called Il Filostrato and completely reverse engineers it into something profound. Some critics call it the first psychological novel in English, even though it's in verse.
Boccaccio wrote a fairly straightforward tragic romance about a Trojan prince and a woman who betrays him. But Chaucer adds immense psychological depth by fundamentally altering two characters. First, the character of Pandarus. In the Italian original, Pandaro is Chryseide's young cousin. Chaucer ages him up and makes him her older uncle.
Right. And by doing that, Pandarus becomes this worldly, cynical, slightly creepy, highly manipulative orchestrator of the affair. He's a failed lover himself, so he lives vicariously through arranging this romance, acting as a philosophical advisor and fixer.
And then there is Chryside herself. In the source material, she is a somewhat simple, fickle woman who falls in love and then quickly betrays her lover when she's sent to the Greek camp. Chaucer transforms her into one of the most complex, practical, unsentimental survivors in literature.
She isn't naive. She's a widow living in the middle of a brutal siege in Troy. She knows her social position is incredibly precarious. When Pandarus tries to manipulate her, you get the sense she sees right through him, but she calculates the political advantage of allying with a prince like Troilus.
Exactly.
And when she is traded to the enemy Greek camp as a prisoner of war, she doesn't betray Troilus out of malice. She adapts to a terrifying new reality to physically survive.
And what's beautiful is that Chaucer doesn't condemn her the way traditional moralists would. He treats her with a profound, aching, tolerant understanding of human limitation. He knows she is flawed, but he forgives her because he understands the terrifying constraints she was under.
Which brings us to his final, glorious phase, the English period, from 1387 until his death in 1400. He takes the romance of the French, the deep philosophy of the Italians, and he finally grounds it completely in the vibrant, messy, muddy reality of his native landscape.
This is the culmination of his comic vision. It is time for his magnum opus, the Canterbury Tales.
The scale of what he attempted here is just mind-boggling. The original plan was for 120 tales. Each of the 30 pilgrims was supposed to tell 2 stories on the 3-day ride to Canterbury and 2 more on the way back.
He only managed to complete 24 before he died. But even in its unfinished state, the framing device is a work of absolute genius.
Let's set the scene. It's April. We are at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, an area just across the Thames from London, known for its taverns and brothels. The opening lines of the general prologue are arguably the most famous in English literature.
When that April with his showers sote, the drought of March hath pursed to the root.
When April with its sweet showers has pierced the drought of March to the root, it starts as a purely biological agricultural description. The rain is reviving the dead earth, the sap is rising in the veins of the plants, the small birds are making melodies because nature is literally pricking them in their courage, their biological urges are firing.
It's a vivid description of the earth waking up, a surge of reproductive physical energy. But then Chaucer pulls off this magnificent pivot. He takes that restless physical, biological energy of spring and seamlessly transmutes it into a spiritual urge.
Exactly. Because the weather is finally nice and the roads aren't rivers of mud, people suddenly feel the urge to go on vacation. Or, in medieval terms, a pilgrimage. They want to travel to the shrine of the martyred St. Thomas of Becket in Canterbury to give thanks for surviving the winter. He links the physical revival of the body directly to the spiritual revival of the soul.
And practically, a pilgrimage was the only socially acceptable reason for different classes of people to travel together. It gives Chaucer the perfect organic excuse to assemble a total cross-section of 14th century English society in one tavern. To understand how he paints these characters, we have to look at the lens he uses his narrator.
Chaucer, the author, creates a fictionalized version of himself, Chaucer the Pilgrim. And this narrator is hilarious. He is a slightly naive, incredibly enthusiastic, middle-of-the-road bourgeois guy. He seems completely uncritical. He just walks around the tavern, buys everyone a drink, and takes everything they say at absolute face value.
This is what critics call the rule of irony in the general prologue. The narrator's wide-eyed, innocent descriptions mask the author's deep, biting satire. The narrator will tell us that a profoundly corrupt clergyman is the best of his profession, but then he will list physical details and behaviors that completely condemn the man.
Let's dive into some of these portraits, because if you want to understand characterization, this is the masterclass. Let's start with the upper echelons of the clergy. The prioress, Madame Eglantine.
A high-ranking nun, the head of a convent, the narrator is immediately dazzled by her elegant manners.
He tells us she sings the divine service beautifully, though she sings it through her nose, which was considered aristocratic. He's incredibly impressed that she speaks French, but then he slips in the detail that she speaks the French of Stratford-at-Bow, which was a local convent outside London. She doesn't speak sophisticated Parisian French. She's speaking a provincial English knockoff because she's desperately, painfully trying to seem like a high-born court lady.
Even her swearing gives her away. Her greatest oath is to St. Eligius,
Who was the patron saint of goldsmiths and courtiers. Not exactly a saint of deep spiritual suffering.
And the irony deepens violently when we look at her idea of charity. The narrator tells us she is so wonderfully tender-hearted that she would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, dead or bleeding.
But wait, a mouse in the 14th century wasn't a cute pet. It was a disease-carrying pest that ate the grain supply. But she cries over it. Meanwhile, the narrator notes she keeps small pet dogs, which was strictly against monastic rules for nuns, and she feeds them roasted meat, milk, and expensive white Westel bread.
Consider the societal context we discussed earlier. Following the plagues and the wars, there were actual human peasants starving to death in the mud outside her convent. Yet she is taking luxury food that poor people would kill for, and feeding it to her illegal lapdogs. She is completely ignoring human suffering to coddle her pets, all while putting on a performance of extreme, delicate sensitivity.
It is a devastating critique wrapped in a compliment. And the absolute kicker, she wears a beautiful golden brooch with a crowned A and a Latin inscription. Amor vince omnia, love conquers all.
Which forces the reader to ask, what kind of love? Is it the divine, selfless love of God, agape, or is it carnal, earthly, romantic love, eros? The ambiguity is the point. Yeah. Chaucer paints a portrait of a woman whose holy vows were perfectly, spectacularly failing to suppress her aristocratic feminine vanity.
Moving on, we have the monk, Don Piers. You'd expect a monk to be pale, quiet, studying manuscripts in a cell.
Not this monk. He is an outrider, meaning his job is to ride around inspecting the monastery's vast agricultural estates. And he has completely rejected the strict ancient rules of St. Augustine and St. Benedict.
The narrator says the monk thinks the old rule that a monk shouldn't be out of his cloister is as crazy as a plucked oyster. He thinks studying books makes you crazy, and manual labor is for peasants.
Instead, he devotes his life to hunting hares. He rides a magnificent, expensive horse, and the bridle is hung with jingling bells that ring in the wind as loud and clear as a chapel bell.
That detail is brilliant. The bells of his worldly vanity are drowning out the spiritual bells of the church. He is dressed in fine gray fur at his sleeves. He has a gold pin shaped like lover's knot under his chin, and his favorite food is a fat swan roasted whole.
He represents the institutional crisis of the church. The monasteries had become massive, wealthy, landowning corporations. This monk isn't a spiritual guide. He's a wealthy estate manager enjoying extreme luxury, utterly abandoning his vows of poverty and asceticism.
And if you thought the monk was bad, he looks like a saint compared to the friar, Hobart.
The contrast here is important. Monks were supposed to be cloistered away from the world. Friars were specifically founded to be out in the world. They were supposed to wander without property, beg for their survival, and minister to the absolute poorest, sickest outcasts of society.
But Hubert flat out hates lepers and beggars. He refuses to deal with the sick because, as he says, there's no profit in dealing with such scum. He only wants to associate with rich country landowners, franklins, and tavern keepers who can give him money and food.
He has turned the sacrament of confession into a highly lucrative extortion racket. He tells people he has special permission from the Pope to hear confessions, and he will grant a very pleasant and easy absolution for your sins, as long as you give him enough silver.
But he is also a total sexual predator wrapped in holy robes. The narrator casually mentions that the friar had arranged and paid for the marriages of many young women at his own cost. Which sounds nice until you realize why he's doing it. He's seducing these girls, getting them pregnant, and then hurriedly buying them husbands to cover up his own tracks. He walks around with his tippet, his hood stuffed full of hairpins and pocket knives to give as gifts to pretty wives. He is utterly corrupted.
So Chaucer has shown us the rot in the church, but he also turns his brilliant observational eye onto the rising middle class. Which brings us to perhaps his most famous, most analyzed, and most magnificent creation, the wife of Bath.
Allison. I am endlessly fascinated by her. She takes up so much space in the text and in our imagination. The narrator tells us she is somewhat deaf and that she is gap-toothed, which in medieval physiognomy was a sign of boldness, wandering, and high sexual appetite. She wears incredibly fine, heavy red stockings and new shoes.
And she is a formidable economic force. She is an expert cloth weaver from Bath, making her independently wealthy. She isn't reliant on a man for her survival. And she has immense, almost aggressive civic pride. If any other woman in the parish dares to walk up to the church altar to give an offering before she does, she gets so furiously angry that she loses all her charity.
And then there's her marital resume. She has had 5 husbands at the church door, meaning legal, legitimate marriages, not even counting the company she kept in her youth.
Astrologically, Chaucer explains exactly what makes her tick. She states in her own prologue that she is a product of Mars and Venus. She combines the fierce, martial, combative energy of Mars with the deep, unashamed sensuality of Venus.
She is basically a bourgeois Amazon, but instead of fighting with the sword on a muddy battlefield, she is fighting a relentless, lifelong gender war in the domestic sphere. She absolutely refuses to be dominated by the patriarchal rules of the medieval church. She uses her wealth, her body, and her incredibly sharp intellect to maintain power over her husbands. She quotes scripture right back at the clerics to justify her lifestyle.
Now, if we stop here, we might think Chaucer was just a bitter cynic who hated everyone in his society. But that's where his profound humanity comes in. Amidst all this corruption and aggressive ambition, he provides genuine, unironic, idealized figures to serve as the moral anchors of the poem, the parson and his brother the plowman.
The parson is the real deal. He is a poor parish priest, but rich in holy thought and work. Unlike the friar who extorts the poor, the parson actually pays the church tithes for his poorest parishioners out of his own incredibly meager pocket. He doesn't abandon his rural parish to go to London and look for a cushy, high-paying job singing masses for wealthy dead people.
He walks miles across his sprawling parish in the rain and the mud, leaning on his staff to visit the sick and the grieving. He actually practices the gospel before he preaches it.
His guiding philosophy, his motto, is just a brilliant piece of logic. If gold rust, what shall iron do?
Meaning, if the priest, the gold, the spiritual leader is corrupt and rusty with sin, how can you possibly expect the common man, the iron, to remain clean and good?
It's a devastating rebuke of the monk and the friar. And traveling alongside the parson is his physical counterpart, his brother, the plowman. He represents the honest, hard-working, pious laborer. He hauls cartloads of dung, lives in peace and perfect charity, loves God best, and loves his neighbor as himself.
They show us that goodness was possible in the 14th century. But Chaucer doesn't let us rest in that comfort, because writing at the very back of the group is the ultimate villain of the piece, the character who embodies the absolute worst of the era, the pardoner.
Okay, for context, pardoners were essentially freelance fundraisers for the church. They rode around selling papal indulgences, basically official pieces of paper stamped by the Pope that promised to forgive your sins or reduce your time in purgatory in exchange for a cash donation.
It was the commercialization of salvation, and the physical description Chaucer gives of the pardoner is intentionally grotesque, deeply unsettling, and heavily symbolic.
He has glaring, staring eyes like a hare. He has a voice that bleats high and thin like a goat. And his hair is this thin, stringy, waxy, yellow mess that hangs down over his shoulders like rat tails. He doesn't wear a hood. He rides bareheaded because he thinks he's riding in the latest, coolest fashion.
But the most shocking detail is the narrator's speculation on his biology. The narrator says, I trow he were a gelding or a mare.
A castrated horse or a female horse.
Right. The narrator is openly suggesting that the partner is a eunuch, or perhaps intersex. He has no beard and never will. In the highly categorized, hierarchical medieval mindset, this places the partner entirely outside the boundaries of normal masculinity and nature. He is biologically sterile, which perfectly mirrors his spiritual sterility. He produces no good fruit.
And his business model is purely predatory fraud. He carries a trunk on his horse packed with incredibly fake relics. He has a pillowcase that he claims is the actual veil of the Virgin Mary. He has a scrap of canvas he claims is a piece of the sail from St. Peter's fishing boat. He has a glass jar stuffed with pig bones.
And he goes out into these poor, uneducated rural parishes, and he sells these pig bones as the holy relics of saints. He sells them to desperate farmers and gullible country parsons.
Now, here's a psychological question. The peasants weren't stupid. They dealt with animals all day. They probably knew what a pig bone looked like. Why did they buy this garbage?
It's a form of medieval Pascal's wager. The partner is preying on ultimate desperation. If your child is dying of a fever, and this charismatic man from the city comes in claiming he has a bone that can perform a miracle, it's probably fake. But what if it's not? Are you really going to hold on to your copper pennies and let your child die without trying? The partner weaponizes their hope and their fear of hell.
Because he possesses a terrifying hypnotic rhetorical skill. He admits in his own prologue that he preaches with such booming, charismatic, theatrical eloquence that he can extract huge sums of money from the poorest widow in the village, even if her children are starving. He is the ultimate spiritual con artist.
So that is the macro view of the societal cross-section on this pilgrimage. We've seen the mechanics of the poetry, the historical trauma, the author's evolution, and the cast of characters. Now, it is time to zoom in. We are going to dive incredibly deep into one specific tale told on this journey, a story told by the nun's priest, Sir John.
This is the Nun Priestess Tale, or the NPT. And if anyone ever asks you to explain the foundational genius of English literature, here is the absolute key. Chaucer takes the highest, most complex philosophical and theological concepts of the 14th century, and he crams them into a story about a barnyard chicken.
It is a supreme masterpiece of tone and genre. The setup relies on a stark, extreme contrast. The story opens by describing a poor, simple, elderly widow. She lives in a tiny, sooty cottage in a narrow valley.
She owns 3 pigs, 3 cows, and a sheep. She eats a very plain diet. No spicy foods, no rich sauces, just brown bread, milk, and maybe an egg. She works hard, she is patient, and she lives a completely moral, unpretentious life. She is the baseline of reality.
But then we step into her dusty barnyard, and the reality instantly warps, because in this dirt yard lives her rooster, Chanticleer.
And Chanticleer does not live like a farm bird. Chaucer describes him as if he were a magnificent, wealthy royal prince. He tells time better than an abbey clock. His comb is redder than fine coral and looks like a crenellated castle wall. His beak shines like jet, his legs are azure, his nails are whiter than lilies, and his feathers shine like burnished gold.
He is a creature of immense vanity, and like an Eastern potentate, he has a harem of 7 hens. But his absolute favorite, his true love and primary wife, is the beautiful, polite, and completely pragmatic hen, Berthelot.
The plot kicks into gear when this idyllic barnyard royalty is disturbed. Chanticleer wakes up in the middle of the night, groaning in terror. He's had a horrifying nightmare about a beast, which he describes exactly like a reddish-yellow fox with black tips on its ears and tail hunting him in the yard.
And this sparks what is essentially a high-level academic disputation, the great debate on dreams. Berthelot immediately takes the clinical scientific view.
He is furious. She basically calls him a coward. She says, "For shame, I cannot love a coward. Women want husbands who are brave and dependable, not guys who scream in the dark."
She applies the medieval medical science we talked about earlier. She tells him the dreams are entirely meaningless. They're simply a symptom of overeating and a physical imbalance of his bodily humors. She diagnoses him with an excess of the red choleric humor.
She tells him he just needs to poop. She prescribes him a diet of worms for a few days, followed by specific herbal laxatives like century and hellebore that are growing right there in the yard. And to prove her point, she quotes the ancient Roman philosopher Cato, who said, take no notice of dreams.
Now, Chanticleer's masculine ego is deeply offended. He feels his intellectual dignity has been challenged by his wife. So rather than taking the laxative, he launches into an incredibly pedantic, sprawling rebuttal to prove that dreams are deeply prophetic and serious.
He verbally pummels her with his library card. He starts citing Cicero, recounting this long, detailed story of two travelers. One sleeps in a barn, the other in an inn. The guy in the inn has a dream where his friend says, "Help, I'm being murdered in a dung cart." He ignores it, goes back to sleep, has the dream again, and wakes up the next morning to find out his friend was actually murdered and hidden in a dung cart exactly as the dream showed.
He doesn't stop there. He cites the commentary of Macrobius on the dream of Scipio. He cites the Old Testament stories of Daniel and Joseph interpreting prophetic dreams. He brings in Croesus, the king of Lydia, and Andromache, the wife of Hector from the Trojan War.
It's completely absurd. He is a chicken standing in the dirt, lecturing another chicken on classical Roman antiquity and biblical exegesis. But here is where it gets really interesting, and where Chaucer's knowledge of human or avian psychology shines. To wrap up his massive argument and reassert his dominance over his wife, Chanticleer quotes a famous Latin proverb to Pertolote, "Mulier est hominis confusio,"
which traditionally translates to "woman is man's ruin," or "woman is man's confusion." It's a very standard piece of medieval monastic misogyny.
But he knows she doesn't speak Latin.
Exactly.
So he translates it for her in English as, "Woman is man's joy and all his bliss." It is a hilariously deliberate, arrogant mistranslation. He gets the last word by insulting her to her face in a language she doesn't understand while pretending to romantically flatter her.
It's incredibly petty. And the supreme irony is that having won the intellectual argument, having proved that his dream of the fox was a deadly serious prophetic warning, he completely ignores the warning. He struts out into the yard, feeling triumphant, and forgets all about the danger.
Which leads us directly to the climax. A coal fox, a sly, black-tipped fox named Russell, has broken through the hedges during the night and is lying low in the cabbage patch waiting. When Chanticleer is out chasing a butterfly, he spots the fox. His natural instinct is to flee. But the fox is a master of rhetoric. He uses the ultimate weapon against a vain creature, flattery.
The fox speaks with incredible courtesy. He says, "Good sir, why would you run? I'm your friend. I didn't come here to eat you. I just came to hear your beautiful voice. Your father and your mother once visited my house, and I assure you, your father had the most angelic voice." And he would stand on his tiptoes, stretch his neck out, and close his eyes to hit the high notes. Can you sing as well as your father?
Chanticleer's ego is his absolute downfall. He wants to prove he is better than his father, so he stands high on his toes, stretches his neck out, exposing his throat, closes his eyes, and begins to crow. And the millisecond his eyes shut, the fox lunges, grabs him by the throat, throws him over his back, and sprints toward the woods.
And the way Chaucer describes the aftermath of this barnyard ambush is the pinnacle of the mock heroic style.
We have to untack the mock heroic. It's when you take a tiny, ridiculous, trivial event and describe it using the grand, elevated, sweeping language of an epic poem like the Iliad or the Aeneid.
Chaucer elevates this chicken getting snatched to the scale of a world-shattering historical tragedy. When the seven hens see Chanticleer captured, they don't just cluck in a panic. Chaucer compares their wailing to the lamentations of the Roman senators' wives when Nero burned Rome. He compares Pertolet's shrieks to the cries of Hasdrubal's wife throwing herself into the fire when the Romans destroyed Carthage.
The poor widow and her two daughters hear the screaming and run out. The dogs are barking and chasing the fox. The pigs are terrified and squealing. The ducks are quacking so hard they look like they're going to die. A swarm of bees even chases them. And Chaucer says the terrifying, deafening noise of this chase was worse than the shouts of Jack Straw and his mob of peasants when they were murdering foreigners during the Peasants' Revolt.
Notice what he did there. He just compared a fox chasing a chicken to a massive, bloody, historical rebellion that had deeply traumatized London just a decade earlier. It is absurdly out of proportion, which makes it hysterically funny.
But in the absolute jaws of defeat, literally, Chanticleer experiences a reversal of fortune. He realizes he can't physically overpower the fox, so he uses his wit. He turns the fox's weapon against him.
He flatters the fox's pride.
Right. He whispers to the fox, "Sir, if I were you, I would turn around and shout insults at those peasants and dogs chasing us. Tell them to turn back. Tell them you've won and that you're going to eat the rooster right now."
The fox, feeling arrogant and proud of his successful heist, thinks this is a great idea. He opens his mouth to shout the insults.
And the exact second his jaws open, the rooster breaks free and flies high up into the branches of a tree. The fox realizes he's been played. He sits under the tree and tries to use flattery again. He says, "Oh, I'm so sorry I scared you. Come back down. I didn't mean any harm."
But Chanticleer has finally learned his lesson. He says, no, if you can talk me into closing my eyes once, shame on you. But if you can talk me into doing it twice, shame on me.
This brings us to the morals of the story. Because it is essentially an animal fable, like Aesop's fables, we expect a neat little moral at the end. But Chaucer, being Chaucer, gives us 3 different morals.
The cock's moral is practical. Keep your eyes open, don't trust flattery, observe reality.
The fox's moral is also practical. Keep your mouth shut when you ought to be quiet. Don't let arrogance make you talk too much.
But the priest, our narrator, offers the final overarching moral. Take the fruit and leave the chaff. Essentially, look past the silly outer shell of the animal story, the chaff, and find the deeper, nutritious moral, meaning the fruit.
But there is a massive philosophical layer buried in this story that we have to talk about. It always trips me up. Right in the middle of the story, just before the fox attacks the rooster, the priest suddenly halts the entire narrative action. He goes on this long, complex theological tangent about St. Augustine, Bishop Bradwardine, Boethius, and the heavy debate between predestination and free will.
He asks whether God's divine foreknowledge forced Chanticleer to fly down from the beams and get caught, or if Chanticleer did it of his own free will, or by conditional necessity.
Why? Why does the priest stop a cartoonish story about a fox and a chicken to deliver a university-level lecture on high theology?
That incongruity is the central joke. Applying the heaviest, most unsolvable philosophical questions of the universe to a rooster standing in a cabbage patch is the absolute peak of the mock-heroic form. But if we consider the psychology of the narrator, it reveals something much deeper about the priest himself.
Okay, let's psychoanalyze Sir John, the nun's priest.
He is a subordinate male traveling with and essentially working for the prioress, a powerful aristocratic woman. During this theological tangent, the priest actively blames woman's counsel for the fall of man. He says it was Pertolotte's bad advice, telling Chanticleer to ignore the dream that led to his downfall, just like Eve's advice led Adam out of paradise.
Ah, so he is using the story of the chickens to vent his own suppressed, passive-aggressive misogyny and frustration against his female boss.
Precisely. But he knows he's on thin ice. So right after he says women's counsel is often fatal, he violently backpedals. He says, oh, I'm just joking. These are just the rooster's words, not mine. I don't mean any harm to women. Read the authors who write about them, you'll see.
He throws the chicken under the bus to save his own job. The psychological depth here is just astounding for the 14th century. The story isn't just a fable, it is a mirror, reflecting the hidden resentments, fears, and character of the man telling it.
So we've walked through the mechanics, the history, the pilgrims, and the tales. What does this all mean for us today? Why does this specific 14th century barnyard fable still matter? And why is Chaucer universally considered the foundation of English literature?
A huge part of it comes down to the literal language he chose to write in. Chaucer wrote in the East Midland dialect.
This is crucial. England was fractured into wildly different dialects at the time. A man from the north of England could barely understand a man from the south. But the East Midland dialect was the speech of London. Because London was the political, legal, and commercial hub of the country, and because Chaucer's work became so massively popular and widely copied, his specific dialect effectively stabilized and became the standard foundation for modern English.
We literally speak the descendants of his words, and his verse style set the template. He popularized iambic pentameter in English, though, as we noted with the mechanics, reading it aloud sounds a bit different than Shakespeare because Chaucer relied heavily on pronouncing the final E on many words like April or sita to maintain that bouncing, rhythmic heartbeat.
His critical legacy over the centuries is equally fascinating, and it shows how the poetics of reading we discussed earlier actually plays out across time. Different eras read him entirely differently. In the 17th century, the great poet John Dryden praised Chaucer as the true father of English poetry.
Dryden famously wrote of the Canterbury Tales, "Here is God's plenty," which is such a perfect phrase. He recognized that Chaucer had captured the absolute, overwhelming totality of human experience, the good, the bad, the holy, and the profane.
But then, jump forward to the 19th century, the prominent Victorian critic Matthew Arnold famously criticized Chaucer. He admitted Chaucer was a great observer, but he claimed Chaucer fell short of true, immortal greatness because he lacked high seriousness.
Arnold essentially said Chaucer was too funny, too earthy, to be ranked alongside the truly great somber poets like Homer or Dante. Did Arnold just completely miss the joke?
He absolutely missed the joke. Arnold was steeped in 19th century Victorian Romanticism, a worldview that equated literary greatness with tragic misery, heavy philosophical brooding, and prophetic solemnity. Arnold also didn't fully understand the linguistic rules for pronouncing Middle English, so he missed the elegant, bouncing musicality of the verse.
He was judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Exactly. Chaucer's genius is not rooted in tragic misery. It is rooted in his serioconic vision. His greatness lies in his humorous, forgiving, and deeply humane acceptance of human limitation. He doesn't expect people to be perfect. He sees the pardoner's greed, the wife of Bath's aggression, the prioress's vanity, and Chanticleer's ridiculous pride. He sees all our flaws, he laughs at them, but he accepts them as an integral part of the human comedy.
Which is such an incredibly refreshing, necessary way to look at the world, especially when the world is undergoing apocalyptic stress, as his was. So, to recap our massive journey today, we've learned how to measure the very heartbeat of a poetic line. We've navigated the apocalyptic, society-breaking landscape of the Black Death, the Hundred Years' War, and the Peasants' Revolt. We've seen how a bored customs agent turned his daily observations into art. We've met a deeply corrupt pardoner selling pig bones to desperate peasants, and we've watched a highly educated, wildly vain rooster quote Cicero to his wife to justify his fear of a fox. If you were ever asked to explain the foundations of British poetry, you now hold the master keys.
You have the mechanical structure, the historical trauma, and the deep literary psychology all tied perfectly together.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought experiment before we go. We've spent this entire time talking about the 14th century, breaking down the glass case of history. But the truth is, human nature hasn't changed one bit. The technology changed, the psychology didn't. Imagine the characters of the general prologue walking around in your life today.
The pardoner wouldn't be riding a horse selling fake religious relics. He'd be running a shady, high-pressure televangelist empire or launching a massive crypto scam on YouTube using his charisma to drain the bank accounts of desperate people.
The wife of Bath wouldn't be weaving cloth in a rural town. She would absolutely be dominating social media debates on gender dynamics, running a massive corporate empire, and refusing to apologize for her ambition or her sexuality.
The monk would be a corporate CEO, completely ignoring ethical constraints and environmental regulations just to maximize his own luxury and comfort, wearing bespoke suits instead of fine gray fur.
Chaucer's pilgrims aren't just historical artifacts trapped under glass. They are the exact same people you interacted with today. They are your coworkers, your politicians, your family members. The glass is broken and the tavern is as loud and crowded as ever. So the ultimate question to ask yourself is this. Who is your inner Chanticleer? What is your particular vanity? And what specific, perfectly tailored flattery might make you close your eyes and crow right when you should be watching the tree line for the fox?
A vital, potentially life-saving question for any era.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep your eyes open, and we'll see you next time.